Don't you know you should never leave the path? Where's grandmother?
A grown man told me to smile, sweetheart.
Oh, hey, you're the wolf, right?
As you're pretty, so be wise. Wolves may lurk in every guise. Those words are translated from the original French rhyming moral at the end of Charles Perrault's famous fairy tale, Little Red Riding Hood. Originally published in 1697, it went on to be retold by two men who are attributed as being the fathers of folklore, the Brothers Grimm. And their version of the story went on to be one of the most well-known stories of all time. But Charles Perrault's original story doesn't have the ending you're used to seeing play out in your storybooks or on screen, and where he got the idea for this story is darker than you could ever imagine. We're going to stray far from the path. Today we're going into the woods to discover the hidden history of Little Red Riding Hood.
One of the best known fairy tales. When you ask people for iconic fairy tale images, they come up with the girl in the red hood.
Perrault's story was first published in 1697 in France in a collection of fairy tales titled Mother Goose Tales, and for a long time, historians and folklorists alike thought that this was as far back as the story of Little Red Riding Hood went. But this brave maiden actually has prehistoric ancestral roots. Now, while Little Red Riding Hood is often attributed to the Brothers Grimm or Charles Perrault, it is actually nothing of their own creation. The Brothers Grimm essentially stole the story from Charles Perrault, and Charles Perrault stole the story from the peasant women of France.
So the origins of Little Red Riding Hood are interesting, and there are many different versions that predate the most famous, which is obviously the Grimm's rendition.
In France, before there was Little Red Riding Hood, there was the story of grandmother, or the grandmother's tale, an oral French folk tale that no one knows when or where it came from or who brought it into being. But we do know it was catalogued by French folklorist Achille Million, and then was later catalogued and analyzed by French folklorist Paul Delarue in 1951. Now, this story is much more ghastly than the Grimm version we're used to hearing, and even more ghastly than the somewhat darker version by Perrault. But before we can fully dive into this ancestor of Little Red Riding Hood, we must first make sure we completely understand Little Red Riding Hood in both its Perrault and Grimm versions first. The version that is most known in pop culture and is most retold and adapted is the version by the Brothers Grimm. In this, she is actually not called Little Red Riding Hood, but rather Little Red Cap. In this story, we are introduced to a little girl in her beloved red cap who is sent out by her mother to deliver a basket of sweets to her grandmother in the woods. Her mother warns her strictly before going to not stray from the path. However, no sooner does Little Red enter the woods does she meet the wolf, who convinces her to tarry from the path and pick flowers. He then is able to beat her to grandmother's house, where he disguises his voice to sound like Little Red to trick the sick grandmother into letting him in.
Who is it? It's your granddaughter, Red.
Once inside, he devours the grandmother, puts on her clothes, gets into bed, and waits for Little Red to arrive. No sooner does Little Red arrive, does she enter the bedroom and see the wolf in her grandmother's clothes, and thus commences one of the most famous scenes in all of storytelling.
What big eyes you have.
Grandma, what big eyes you got.
What
big eyes you have.
Are we just gonna sit around here and talk about how big I'm getting?
My, what big, you know what, I'm sorry, I can't. I can't do this. I'm not an idiot. My grandma is a human woman. How is this ever a scene?
The wolf gobbles her up too. Then he falls asleep and begins to snore. A passing by woodsman hears this snoring and thinks to himself that it could not possibly be Granny. So he goes inside, he cuts open the wolf's belly and frees Little Red and Granny. Granny then suggests that they fill the wolf's belly up with stones and sew it shut so that when he wakes up and tries to run away, he will fall down dead. This happens. Then the woodsman skins the wolf to keep the pelt. The three of them share a nice meal together, and Little Red promises that she will never stray from the path again. Charles Perrault's version, which predates this version, is an almost identical tale, save for one editorial liberty taken by the Grimm brothers: the ending. In Perrault's version, there is no woodsman. The wolf eats Little Red Riding Hood, and that's it. That's the whole ending. She dies a horrible death, and there is no savior to rescue her from the literal belly of the beast. So now you're probably wondering about the ancestral story told by peasant women that I mentioned earlier. Is it similar to the story that we know? Well, in this version, Little Red doesn't meet a wolf on the path, but rather a werewolf. And once again, he does trick her and get to Granny's house first. Once he gets to Granny's, he eats her. But then in a sick fashion, he turns Granny's body into a meat pie and her blood into wine. And upon Little Red's arrival at the house, the wolf tricks her into consuming both. He then commands her to take off all her clothes and burn them and get into bed with him. Little Red, still thinking this is the command of her grandmother, obeys, but upon entering the bed, realizes her dire mistake. She makes an excuse of escape, though, by saying she has to go to the bathroom. The wolf, however, ties a piece of string around her finger so he will know if she tries to run away when she gets outside. She dupes him, however, though, and slips the string onto the branch of a plum tree and begins to run home. Once the wolf realizes she's been gone for a while, he goes outside and realizes that he has been fooled. He takes off after her, but she gets home just in time, slamming the door in his face before he can catch her. There's a lot to unpack here. How did Perrault hear this story, and what compelled him to change it? And does it have an intended moral the way that Perrault's does? And is there a significance to this plot that differs so heavily from the story of Little Red Riding Hood that we know today?
Yes, I have heard of The Grandmother's Tale, and it's actually the one I drew inspiration from to include a werewolf in my novel Scarlette. This is sort of a dark tale, more likely commonly recognized and widely circulating around France in the 1600s. I'd be shocked if Perrault had known and drawn from it. It seems evident that he drew from this and similar versions, but made it his own to fit his own perspectives. And like many writers in history, including the Grimms, Perrault changed it just to fit his own purposes.
How Perrault heard this story is unknown for sure, but it is highly suspected that he heard the story from a woman, more specifically, a salon woman. During Perrault's time at the court of Versailles during the late 17th century, there was a societal battle going on in France between a group calling themselves the Ancients and a group calling themselves the Moderns. The Moderns believed in the equality of the sexes and the right for gender fluidity. These beliefs took form in the fight for women to be allowed an equal education and for men and women alike to be able to wear whatever clothes or makeup they saw fit, regardless of what societal gender norms at the time may have dictated. The Ancients, as you might have guessed, were the group of men and women who were highly opposed to all of the Moderns' ideals. They believed that if a woman acquired an education, it would distract from her attention on tasks of the home, which were the only tasks the Ancient believed any woman should be concerned about. They also believed that gender-bending societal norms would destroy marriages, families, and was a great offense to the sanctity of high society. The Ancients, however, were on the losing side of this battle, because King Louis XIV was not only a fan of pomp and spectacle, wearing lavish wigs, clothes, jewels, makeup, and high heels, but his brother was an open crossdresser, frequently showing up to court functions presenting as whichever gender he felt like at the time. Also, Perrault himself was the suspected anonymous co-author of a popular short story at the time about a crossdresser.
Some writers have claimed, specifically Catherine Ornstein and Anne Sexton, the poet, have claimed that the wolf wearing the grandmother's clothes was a commentary on gender fluidity and oppressive gender norms in France at the time. Do you think that's purposeful, or that's just randomly in the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a totally valid way to read it. that they were doing something transgressive again. I think that idea of transgression is really key to the Red Riding Hood story as a whole.
Charles Perrault and the other salon writers of the time, they did write fairy tales with sort of political commentary.
Still, the ancients were prominent in Versailles, so because of this, the moderns sought a place where they could congregate with like-minded individuals, and thus the salon was born. And the ancients hated them, namely for two reasons. One, they were co-ed. Two, they were typically run by women. Women for so long had been excluded from intellectual debates, were now facilitating their own establishments where they could take part and steer the conversation over intellectual discussions that they had so long been excluded from. But even crazier than all this was the lack of class divides in the salons. Commoners could come in off the streets, sit down, and converse with the aristocrats. There were no barriers. Nothing like this had ever existed before, and it was here in this new age of the French salons that storytelling became a popular pastime. Charles Perrault was a proud modern, a frequenter of salons, and it is here that it is believed he first heard the grandmother's tale. But why was this grown man so obsessed with this working class folktale? Well, keep in mind what kind of man Perrault was. Here was a story about a spunky little girl who goes out into the world independently and a male wolf who dresses in drag via her grandmother's clothes. Knowing everything we do about Perrault, this certainly seemed like the kind of story he'd want to tell. We already know that Perrault edited the story he heard in the salons, and that the Grimm brothers would go on to edit it even more. But before we dissect the editorial choices of these men, let us first discuss the storytelling choices of the working class women who wove the story that was their inspiration. The Grandmother's Tale has several key differences from Perrault's tale. It is explicitly sexual. The wolf is not just a regular wolf who can somehow talk, but rather a werewolf, and most importantly, the girl saves herself in the end.
The story of Grandmother would have been set in a rural peasant sort of setting.
Yeah.
And so the miscellaneous details that you kind of like cock your head at, like, are you going to take the path of pins or the path of needles?
Yeah.
Well, that would have been something of an initiation ritual or a rite of passage for the rural French peasant woman.
The sexual undertones in this version of the story come to light almost immediately when we learn that it is not a wolf who corners Little Red on the path, but rather a werewolf. This means we don't know what form he's coming to her in, wolf or man. But worse than that, there would be another reason working class women would be telling their children stories about werewolves cornering little girls in the woods. And that's because it actually happened.
In 1589, in Bedford, Germany, which at the time was a French territory, women and children started going missing along the countryside. Now, authorities were alerted when loved ones went missing, and while sometimes they vanished without a trace, other times parts of them would be discovered, limbs and body parts half-eaten by what appeared to be some kind of wild beast. Sometimes nearly intact bodies were discovered, showing signs of having been sexually violated. Who could be doing this? Not just any animal could, and many started to believe that it was the work of werewolves.
It seemed that everything during this time was explained with black magic. There were, however, a few cases that really stuck out during these werewolf attacks. One gaining huge international publicity was, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, was Peter Stump's trial in Germany in the 1580s.
Peter had been accused by numerous witnesses of committing these deadly and disturbing deeds. And when he was confronted by the authorities, he didn't deny them, but rather proudly claimed that he had made a deal with the devil himself, selling his soul in return for a magic cloak that could turn him into a wolf. And once he was in his wolf form, he would go around the countryside devouring women and children. And actually, Peter's assaults began long before this. Prior to being caught, he had raped and killed his own daughter. This man, whether or not he could actually turn into a beast, really was the wolf of the wood. And what's worse is he wasn't the only one.
A few people who believed in something, I think it was called the Benandanti, where they believed they were werewolves. It's kind of part of a series of traditions where people believed they were traveling with the witches or the fairies.
Bad wolf attacks. Like, their wolf attacks were at an all-time high in France at the time. There's a lot of discussion about whether it was a lion or a strange wolf-dog hybrid. They're not really sure. That's really beside the point. The point is that there were these attacks happening that were connected to both a narrative about them as like it's either a werewolf or some kind of powerful demonic wolf or something like that.
While the rest of Europe this time was experiencing the witch hunt craze or the burning times, France and Germany were in the midst of their werewolf trials. Numerous men across France and Germany were being accused and proudly admitting to turning into wolves so that they could assault women and children. The cause of this was never known for sure. Many believed that these men had in fact made deals with devils. Others believed that witches had put curses on them. Another group of people believed this to be a mental disorder we know today as lycanthropy, a state of madness or delusion that leads one to believe they can turn into a beast.
So if you were a peasant in France or Germany at the time, and you couldn't afford the safety of reinforced palace walls, you were now faced with an all-new fear for your children, and if you were a woman, for yourself. That a ravenous wolf might attack you on your way home. So parents began to warn children about wolves in the woods, and mothers began to warn daughters not to trust strange men. And after time, it is suspected that all of these warnings morphed into one singular story about a brave little girl in the woods on her way to grandmother's house. So if in the original version of Little Red Riding Hood, the girl saves herself in the end, what happened? What changed? What got lost in translation? And why did Perrault, a man who was supposedly for the advancement of women, write a story that condemned them so entirely?
To answer this question, we have to stop beating around the bush. Little Red Riding Hood undoubtedly has elements of a rape allegory.
Do you think the story can be read or should be read as a rape allegory?
Yes, I think it can and should be.
Was like in the woods and she like was picking the flowers and then she like runs into the wolf. And it seemed very like sexual assault-esque to me.
Solid interpretation is that women should be wary of men.
The little girl is cornered alone in the woods by a male predator and then is later tricked into getting into bed with him so that he can devour her. Devour was a word that was often used in fairy tales to allude to sex. And keep in mind, working class women were telling this story because it came into being from true cases of real men, not just eating children and women, but sexually assaulting them as well. Charles Perrault undoubtedly knew all of this when he decided to retell the tale, so why did he change the ending? Well, he had his own agenda, as many writers do, and it may not have been women's rights, or not the way we'd think of them initially. Some have argued that he changed the story's ending to punish women, but I don't think that's the case. Let's take a look again at the ending moral of his version of Little Red Riding Hood.
Little girls, this seems to say, never stop upon your way. Never trust a stranger friend, you never know where it may end. As you're pretty, so be wise, wolves may lurk in every guise. Now as then 'tis simple truth, sweetest tongue has sharpest tooth. To me, that doesn't sound like a condemnation at all, but rather a warning. A warning to a very specific audience. High-born women. In The Grandmother's Tale, a story being told amongst peasants, it is easy to understand that the protagonist is a peasant also, and therefore was raised with a very different worldview than high-born women would have been. Children of the lower class had to grow up a lot quicker because they simply couldn't be afforded the luxury of extended childhood, and this included safety or the illusion of safety. So their story shows a young girl outsmarting the wolf, but would a sheltered high-born woman be able to use the same tricks to escape to safety as the original heroine did? Perrault suspected not, and not because he didn't believe high-born women were smart, but because they had been raised to be a kind of obedient that lower-class women had not been. Women were assaulted. It happened, even somewhere as dazzling as Versailles. But back then, rape was seen as a property crime against the father of the victim. Now, while a working class woman's reputation wouldn't necessarily be that tarnished by being sexually assaulted, a highborn woman's entire life could very well be ruined by it, especially if she was a virgin or unwed when it happened.
As a leading intellectual in his time, his work in government would have brought him up close and personal with the promiscuous nature of King Louis XIV's court. And in addition to his observations at court, He would have known and understood the contemporary marriage customs, which were not necessarily in a woman's favor, I have to say. A woman could only marry if she was a virgin and if she was deflowered, so to speak. A marriage could be called off, and this could result in severe punishment for a young woman, including families banishing them or jail time. But obeying one's father and the chaste customs at the time was imperative to survival in the old regime. There literally was no immunity from an ill reputation.
If you're a pretty girl, you need to be careful of men because they will all try to get you to sleep with them.
What if he could change the story to be more fitting for their specific circumstance? The Grandmother's Tale was the perfect conduit for this. But because of this editorial liberty Charles Perrault took with another class culture story, he inadvertently erased the original story from history, turning Little Red Riding Hood into an incompetent victim for centuries to come, and all this would only be made worse when two brothers got their hands on the story and added an ending that not only condemned the victim, but blamed her for her own assault.
If there's one thing to know about the Grimm brothers, it's that they were liars. The Grimm brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm, told everyone that they'd collected their tales by traveling across to peasant villages all throughout Germany and taking great detail to catalog their stories exactly. None of this is true.
Do you have an opinion? Do you think they're big liars? Or...
So they were scholar activists, and when they began collecting their tales, they were trying to prove that Germany has a united cultural heritage as evidenced by the body of their folk tales. Now, that was not actually what was going on. They had a lot of their informants who were middle-class French Huguenot women, like second generation immigrants. So what they said they did, what they did, a little bit of a gap there.
Not the same thing.
I think the Grimm brothers absolutely altered and adjusted their stories based on, their own values and what they wanted the stories to tell.
A hood became a cap, and a sad ending was changed into a relatively happy ending.
It has a happy ending. The girl and her grandmother are rescued, and the wolf gets the gruesome fairy tale villain ending. I think people may have found that more satisfying or encouraging.
Yeah, I just feel like it was warped due to the fact that there were children involved.
They added a bit more to Little Red Riding Hood's mother than Perrault or the Grandmother's Tale did. In the Grimm brothers' version, the mother sternly warns Little Red not to stray from the path, but she does, and it is then made clear at the end of the story that this is why she was eaten by the wolf. So it started as a story that was told to make working-class girls brave.
The Grandmother's Tale, the heroine goes out into the world, so to speak, and learns a transformative lesson and is able to outsmart the villain and return home with her new knowledge and strength.
Had turned, in Perrault's hands, into a warning for noble women to not trust noble men, and then had turned in the Grimm brothers' hand into the ultimate blame the victim narrative.
Little Red Riding Hood does become weaker in the Grimm's version.
And because of how successfully the Grimm brothers marketed their stolen stories, it's their version that's stuck in the public consciousness, even to this day.
But while their version of the story is the most endurable one, their intended perception and interpretation has in fact not really stood the test of time. Because come the 21st century, Little Red Riding Hood had become a feminist figure.
I'll hurt you.
Who the hell are you?
And if you come any closer, I'll bite you and smile red.
You might think that must be it. I've taken us from the 16th century werewolf trials to the 17th century French salons, through the countryside of 18th century Germany and 1920s Disney cartoons, all the way to today. What more could there possibly be to say about such a short little story about a girl in a red hood and a wolf in the wood? Well, frankly, a lot more.
According to the Arne Thompson Types of Folktale Encyclopedia, which is used by folklorists to track similarities in oral stories across continents, there are 33 cataloged versions of Little Red Riding Hood. There is an Italian version that features a set of sisters going into the woods as opposed to just one girl. There's also a set of sisters in a Chinese version that features a tiger instead of a wolf. There's yet another French version where when the wolf goes to try and eat Little Red Riding Hood, she ducks her head and he accidentally grabs her cloak and swallows it, and as it turns out, her cloak is magical, and being golden orange in this version instead of red, possesses the same properties as fire and burns the wolf from the inside out. There is a Latin version in which a girl is kidnapped by a wolf to be fed to its cubs, but her magic red tunic she received as a baptism gift protects her from their teeth. There's a Taiwanese version, a Puerto Rican version, an Austrian version, a Brazilian version, and the earliest version that is cataloged dates back all the way to the 1st century in the Middle East and is called The Wolf and Kids. Similar to the Chinese version, which features a set of siblings being accosted by a beast in their own home, this version features a set of billy goat kids that are tricked into letting a wolf into their home while their mother is away. The wolf does eat them, but in this version, the mother returns home and saves them. Goats usually represent success and self-reliance when they appear in ancient stories. So the fact that the original victims of one of the earliest versions of a Little Red Riding Hood narrative were goats and then were saved by a female goat makes this one of the greatest stories of female empowerment.
But guess what? The story actually dates back even further than that. You can find elements of it in prehistoric Greek and Nordic myths. In the Greek myth, the legend of Lycaon, the evil king Lycaon tries to trick Zeus into eating human flesh. But Zeus, of course, is not fooled by this, and as punishment, curses him to turn into a wolf. Lycaon being a root of the word lycanthropy, which, if you'll remember from earlier, is the word used to describe the mania that plagued the men of France and Germany into thinking they were werewolves, thus causing them to go out and devour women and children. We can also see in this myth the element from the grandmother's tale of tricking a guest into eating human flesh. In the Nordic myth, the saga of Bull Songs, 3 men receive cloaks from the gods that give them the ability to turn into wolves. These 3 men then use their new ability as tricksters with a second skin to capture a woman and force her to become one of their brides. This parallels similar themes from Little Red Riding Hood stories, with wolves representing untrustworthy men that women should be wary of, and also plays into the elements of narratives of men like Stube Pizza, who believed they had received divine cloaks that gave them the ability to turn into wolves.
Elements of the story even appear in the Bible, in the Gospel of Matthew, where it says, "Beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves." The wolf in Little Red Riding Hood may be wearing granny's clothing as opposed to sheep's clothing, but he is a false prophet nonetheless, who should not be trusted. But all of this is just scratching the surface. Think of all the other places this story shows itself without us realizing. Sansa Stark in Game of Thrones has bright red hair and keeps a wolf as a pet, but also over the course of the first season is harassed by a frightening man called the Hound. In The Handmaid's Tale, women who are kept as sex slaves by beastly men must wear a uniform of red-hooded cloaks. Wolves lurk outside Count Dracula's castle as he waits inside, ready to attack the next unsuspecting woman who comes along. This story is woven into the very fabric of our world. It is universal and also forever changing and evolving.
I think that the elements of Little Red Riding Hood are virtually everywhere. Anytime you see a film or book that plays on an innocent, naive person being deceived, could be construed as circling back to the Little Red Riding Hood narrative. I see strong Little Red Riding Hood themes from Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles all the way to AMC's Mad Men. The fairy tales themes are so universal, they literally are in plain sight all around us.
It is very present.
We will never be able to know for sure where exactly this story first began. Who was the first person to tell the tale of a child going out alone into the woods and set upon by a beast? But moreover, I don't think we'll ever hear this story end. It will continue to change and be reimagined and retold for each new generation. Why? Why is this one story that is essentially so simple and honestly a little silly such a constant in human culture?
I think that the tale has endured for a few reasons. First, partially good marketing by the Grimms. And second, a scarcity within the literature marketplace during the Victorian era for really good children's stories. Today, we take it for granted how large and accessible literature is, and with children's literature and young adult literature being no exception.
It's something people would have had everyday experience with in other times, like living in an area that might have been like the one in the story.
I think that a lot of the imagery in the story has become really powerful in terms of it being a vulnerable girl versus like a force of nature almost, like because wolves are, in the West at least, they're very symbolic of like the wild.
Be wary of men because they'll rape you and they'll devour you.
It still tracks.
Yeah.
The timeless part of that story.
It holds up.
Like other fairy tales, Little Red Riding Hood was told as a cautionary story or a parable against the backdrop of real events that peasants would be, again, all too familiar with.
I think that we're still really grappling with questions of rape culture and victim blaming and things like that, and it's just the story kind of let us work through some of that. I don't know which side we're working our way to. I think that there are still a lot of problems with victim blaming and rape culture, especially in America right now.
Parables have lasting power. These types of stories have been passed down for centuries.
I feel like it's just one of those stories that like people like to go back to and re-experience every once in a while.
Stopping kids in the middle of the forest? That's pretty creepy.
Feel like I'm being sold.
Little Red Riding Hood reminds us that fear is not forever. Wolves can be slain, good can triumph in the end, and no matter how dark or lonely it gets, there's always a way out of the woods.
So, what happened with you and those 3 little pigs? Why did you want to eat them so badly?
It's so amazing that that's what people think happened.